Welcome. Thanks for joining us for this Climate Week panel on the climate and environmental implications of industrial scale animal agriculture. I'm Jamie Smith Hopkins, managing editor at Inside Climate News. I'm joined today by 4 ICN journalists who have reported on numerous aspects of how the United States raises most of the meat we eat in large, concentrated animal feeding operations, also known as CAFOs. Georgina Gustin covers agriculture for ICN. She's reported for years on the many ways that farming, food systems, and the environment intersect. Her stories have taken her around the world, from Kazakhstan to Peru. Lisa Sorg covers North Carolina, one of the nation's top hog producers. She's written about the impacts on nearby residents, many of them people of color, and the battle to get help from regulators. Phil McKenna's beat at ICN includes climate superpollutants like methane. Beef and dairy CAFOs are among the sources of that potent greenhouse gas. And Anika Jane Beamer covers Iowa, where manure from CAFOs contributes to a long-running and far-reaching water contamination problem. So let's start with the basics. What are CAFOs? How does this form of animal agriculture compare with the way we went about it a few generations ago? And what are some consequences of that change? Georgina?
Yeah, so very simply, a CAFO is a facility where thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of animals are raised. They are fed if mechanically, in most cases. Their manure is collected mechanically. They are raised in such conditions that bring them to slaughter weight efficiently and as fast as possible. And maybe 50, 60 years ago, this was not how animals were raised in this country. They were raised mostly on small farms, outdoors. But in the late 70s or early 80s, farmers started to realize that this efficient method was preferred, and it became kind of the way we raise most of our animals in this country. And if you look at big swaths of the Midwest now, you'll see that there are no fences, in fact, because they're not needed. All the animals are inside these huge facilities. And from a climate perspective, the reason this is important is because it's not because we have more animals, although in many cases we do. It's because when you put them all together in one place, they generate a lot of manure in conditions that generate a lot of methane, which is, as you pointed out, an especially potent greenhouse gas. So from a climate perspective, that's the big sort of problem with CAFOs.
Yeah, and I would just jump in as I looked at it too in our reporting, and some of it just looking at satellite images. I mean, the size and scope of these facilities is just huge. Hundreds of acres, and in some cases more than 100,000 head of cattle at the feedlots we looked at. And another thing that really struck out at me was just the complete lack of information. So the EPA has acknowledged that they have no accurate nationwide inventory of CAFOs, and about a third of the largest CAFOs lack basic wastewater permits.
That's very true, Phil. I was thinking about the North Carolina example where, well, I would like to say first that the consequences of this politically, the reason, there aren't things that, the lack of transparency, the lack of climate policy, the lack of regulation is that, this is a highly concentrated conglomerate industry where only a few companies have the monopoly. So they wield enormous political power, which when you combine that with the Farm Bureau, it really influences state and federal legislation that is favorable to them. So in terms of the lack of transparency, to your point, Phil, in North Carolina, we don't know where most of the chicken CAFOs are because they aren't required to have a permit, so there's no way to track them. We also don't know where the gathering lines are for biogas installations because the pork producers say that is a matter of national security and we have no right to know. So yes, it's really kind of aggravating about how little information we can get, but the outsized influence of these industries are on the planet.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and add a little bit of dimension to the consolidation that both Georgina and Lisa talked about. So 50 years ago in Iowa, which is it's currently the nation's leading pork producer, there were about 50,000 hog farms. Um, as of a few years ago, there were less than 6,000. But also 50 years ago, the average number of hogs on those farms was just under 500. And now the average number of hogs on an Iowa hog farm is almost 12,000. So we've seen this massive collapse of an industry into these super densely populated and thus densely polluting CAFOs. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, from a climate perspective, when you put all of these animals together, they generate so much manure. This is an interesting statistic. That this is just from the large CAFOs. They generate 20 times more manure than humans. So it's a huge amount of manure. And you know, all of that, if you factor in the enteric emissions, which are the burps from cattle, which are the biggest producers of methane, if you combine the enteric emissions with the manure, this country produces as much methane as just from that sector as all of Spain, which is just a massive amount of this very, very potent greenhouse gas that's also extremely urgent to address in a climate context, because we could actually do something about it.
Yeah, we'll be getting more into the some of the intricacies of the methane piece of it, just because both you and Phil have done such great reporting on that. Before we do, I wanted to ask a little bit about the considerations for residents living nearby these facilities. You know, what has that been like, as well as you know, what is it like inside these facilities for the animals themselves?
Well, if you drive down Interstate 40 down east in North Carolina, you will start to smell these CAFOs. And I mean, there have been times when I've wanted to throw up. It's been so bad. And that's just my driving down the highway. For folks who live next to them, and I've met with folks who live next to these enormous farms, and you know, it's not just one. There's often several within a very small square amount of acreage. It's They can't go outside in the summertime. They can't hang their laundry on the line. They can't have barbecues. They can't have picnics or their kids over. And this was explained in great detail during some federal hog nuisance suits that originated in North Carolina. So it's very onerous. And of course, you know, sometimes there are even buzzards because there are dead boxes that hold the hogs that have died. And so these folks who live next to these CAFOs would describe them as incredibly onerous.
Georgina, did you want to discuss a little bit about the conditions inside? I'm sure that varies.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of these chicken CAFOs, there are hundreds of thousands of birds in these places, and despite the advocacy groups trying to get better standards, better living standards, like access to outdoors for these animals, they haven't really been able to do that, and it's very difficult to police. So in some parts of the Delmarva Peninsula, so that's you know, east of Washington, D.C., Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland, which produces you know, a huge amount of poultry, you have barns that are filled with dead birds. Because they're just basically, you know, the disease spreads so rapidly. They're so on top of each other that they're basically smothering each other. They're these barns where they put all of the dead birds, and in the summer heat, they just explode because of all of the noxious fumes. I mean, and you can barely walk in, as Lisa said, you can barely walk into one of these facilities. So, and in some of these hog CAFOs, the industry does not let you in, by the way, anymore. You cannot, reporters cannot get in and see these because there's been a lot of critical coverage. So it's like super high security lockdown situation. So it's hard to actually get in and see, but advocacy groups have and done, and you hear of these horrific situations. These animals are not living good lives. They don't see the light of day. A lot of the sows are in crates where they can't turn around. This is not a good life for these animals. I mean, in the case of cattle, their early months and are out on grass, but then they're brought into confinement and really smashed together. And yeah, it's I've been in a lot of cattle CAFOs here and in other countries, and um, yeah, it's not a pretty picture.
Well, and to Georgina's point about the security and the inability for reporters to get in there, in North Carolina in 2015, the state legislature passed a law called the Property Protection Act. It was basically an ag-gag law, and it allowed the courts to assess $5,000 in civil penalties per day on employees who documented the alleged wrongdoing. And that could be in video, audio, written work, anything that then got out into the public. That was struck down as unconstitutional because it was content based in terms of the discrimination of the types of speech that would be penalized. But it was, it was in force for 5 years. And it could also have been extrapolated to other sorts of monitoring, nursing homes or, other places where you want eyes, independent eyes watching and monitoring. So that's been struck down, but you still, you can't get in there.
Thank you for that overview. So let's delve more into water impacts. What types of contamination are we seeing and what can be done about that?
Yeah, so in terms of water impacts, a lot of it comes from those copious amounts of manure that Georgina was alluding to. And there are kind of two mechanisms where we get water contamination. The first is on site when the manure storage pits are leaking, perhaps they're not adequately lined, or also when they're overflowing after rainfall and that's entering nearby soil, surface water, groundwater even. And you have these kind of unquantified amounts of manure and contaminants leaving the CAFO. And then the other big way that we see water contamination, and this is perhaps a bigger issue in Iowa, is when manure from CAFOs is spread on agricultural fields as fertilizer. Um, Manure contains a lot of plant nutrients, but anything that those plants can't take off is going to leave the fields in the form of water runoff, soil erosion, etc. Um, in terms of what those contaminants are, probably the biggest concern is nitrate. Um, it's one of the most common forms of nitrogen. It's water soluble though, so it really easily ends up in waterways. And at high levels, it's linked to a lot of cancers. It causes some really big um, oxygen depleting illnesses in children. So you see blue baby syndrome from high nitrate levels. And that's something that Iowa has really struggled with over the years, and especially this summer with water treatment plants struggling to keep on top of just the record levels of nitrate in rivers. Then there's also phosphorus. That's entering water in soil erosion mostly, and that's what fuels the blue-green algae blooms that are really striking when seen from above. Um, and those produce microcystins, which are toxins really toxic to the liver. So you'll see beaches shut down. And then also there's just the pathogens, manure is full of all sorts of microbial life. Um, and that is entering waterways, and we don't necessarily know what's in there and how concerning all of it is. Yeah.
Thank you. Lisa?
Well, very similar in North Carolina, the spray field, when they wash out the barns, they flush them into these giant lagoons. And when I say giant, it's like football fields worth of lagoons. These are not, a little kiddie pool. And then they use these aerial spray systems to then spray that on their farm fields. And so what can also happen is that waste then seeps into the groundwater, which, depending on how close you are to the farm, it could get into your private drinking water well, depending on the integrity of your well. Some of these wells are very old. The casings aren't bad, are bad, I'm saying. And so there is a private drinking water threat. I know of a church that is near several farms that had to drill a new well because their drinking water was contaminated to the point where the health department told them they shouldn't even wash their hands in it. So yes, the water contamination is a big deal. Of course, here we have hurricanes. So when those hurricanes blow through, sometimes the lagoons breach or overtop, and then you've got dead pigs and waste just all over the countryside. So serious water impacts, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And Georgina, these impacts end up affecting not just the states with a lot of CAFOs, don't they? This has impacts on other states too. Like for instance, Louisiana experiencing, some of this runoff hitting waterways there.
For sure. So you take the whole Mississippi River watershed. It's huge. It encompasses, I think it's 22 states. Somebody should check my math on that. But that whole watershed, which has some of the biggest CAFO concentrations, but also the largest areas of cropland, and that a lot of that cropland is devoted to growing feed for that go into these animals that live in these CAFOs, and all of that gets kind of drained into the Mississippi River and ends up going into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's where you have these huge hypoxic areas where you have these anaerobic conditions caused by all of this runoff. People can't swim there, fish die. There have actually been conversations between people in the upper part of farmers in the upper part of the Mississippi River watershed and the fishermen's groups in the Gulf of Mexico to try to address this problem, because people are realizing that there's a huge, sort of long chain leading from the headwaters of the Mississippi River all the way down to Louisiana, and that these connections need to be talked about to varying degrees of success. But yeah, the effects are pretty far flung.
And Georgina, could you define hypoxia, just because that's going to come up in a lot of waterways?
Yeah, so hypoxia basically is a situation in which there's a lack of oxygen in the water. And when there's no oxygen in the water, the plant and aquatic life die.
Thank you all. Well, moving on to greenhouse gases, Phil and Georgina, you co-reported a series earlier about the potent greenhouse gas emitted by dairy cattle and how little the government is doing to measure that impact. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you found and what the opportunities are for reducing those methane emissions. Phil?
Sure, yeah. So nationwide, we know that cows, from their burps and their manure, they emit more than twice as much methane as all of the country's oil and gas wells combined. But where exactly this happens is a complete black box. There's a federal greenhouse gas reporting program that requires facility level emissions reporting across all sectors of the economy, except for agriculture. So we wanted to find out where these large CAFOs were, what were some of the largest greenhouse gas emitting dairies and feedlots in the country. And we ended up looking at California and Texas, where there was at least some information on the number of cows at these individual CAFOs that we were able to obtain through their wastewater permits. And from there, we were able to calculate greenhouse gas emissions from each facility based on the number of cows and the type of cows that they had. And the findings were pretty surprising. We found that the largest single source of methane emissions in California, it wasn't a refinery or a landfill or a well, but it was a feedlot near the US-Mexico border that had more than 100,000 head of cattle. Similarly, we looked at Texas and we found that the largest dairy in the state had methane emissions that approached the annual greenhouse gas equivalent of 250,000 automobiles. So pretty surprising findings. Solutions, I can get more into those later, but I guess I'll just say that there's no easy solution.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the solutions part. there's been a lot of work by the dairy industry on feed additives that could potentially cut the amount of methane that cows burp. Nothing has been, widely adopted or employed that I'm aware of, and a lot of this has been a little bit questionable, to be honest. There's also the growing adoption of biodigesters, which basically you put like a cap on these big manure lagoons and you pipe off the biogas and you feed that into the grid. Arguably, and well, not just arguably, but the data in some places show that that has actually encouraged the construction of more dairy CAFOs. So it's kind of becoming a solution that's engendering a problem. So as far as we know, there are some practices that might minimize the methane emissions off of dairy and cattle CAFOs, but our appetite for dairy and beef and global appetite for dairy and beef continues to climb. And so the incentives on the part of the industry are really just for more growth, and there's not a lot on the solution side.
Got it. Thank you. Well, on that note, let's move over to sort of solutions writ large. Like, how can CAFOs reduce their impact on neighbors, water quality, climate, other impacts like that? And are people talking about alternatives to CAFOs, or is it a lot of this about how does the country make CAFOs less impactful? Georgina?
Yeah. As I was just saying, I don't think any of the solutions have really been widely adopted or are conceived to be effective given the scope of the problem, the number of animals, the number of CAFOs, the demand that we have in the US and globally. There have been a lot of government and academic reports that say one of the simple solutions, and nobody wants to hear this really, certainly not the industry, that we basically, especially in developed countries, we need to cut back on our dairy and meat consumption, and that the demand side of the equation is really where the problem is. So that, and it just makes sense, if we cut our demand for these polluting industries, the pollution will go down, but that does not seem to be the case, or there's not a lot of political willingness to do that. Although there are increasing numbers of vegetarians and vegans here and around the world, there are enough countries, particularly developing countries, where appetites and demand are going up for these commodities. So aside from cutting demand in developing countries, which are the bulk of consumers of these things, there are these kind of nibbling around the edges solutions like feed additives or biodigesters or even rotational grazing and various other measures that can be employed to minimize the impact. The only real way to do it is to cut demand.
Got it. Phil, did you want to say a few more things on the climate side?
I think Georgina hit the main ones. So one thing that I found was interesting was the manure management. As you put in digesters and there's incentives for them, it can drive more production of dairy farms. But it can also drive more production of methane in that farmers want to maximize the amount of methane they produce. So the way they manage their methane, more wet than dry management produces even more methane, when other measures, dry handling, composting of manure, would really bring down methane emissions. So yeah, a lot of potential solutions nibbling around the edges, but a lot of them have challenges and might create problems as well.
Got it. Yeah, it's interesting to see sometimes how incentives don't necessarily drive the behavior that people were expecting. Anika Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth noting that a lot of these incentives or possible solutions are on a voluntary basis. In general, agriculture in the United States, including livestock agriculture, is pretty minimally regulated. Most of it's exempt from Clean Water Act regulations, for example. And so what we've seen is that these opt-in options for farmers, whether they're subsidized or technical support, they haven't been sufficient. They've been on the table for decades at this point. And what we've seen is CAFO pollution get worse, not better.
And then Lisa, what would you like to add to that?
Well, there is, Georgina was talking about nibbling around the edges, and there is a kind of a nascent industry happening here, and it remains to be seen how viable and successful it is. But this company the town is called Turkey, North Carolina, because there's a huge butterball factory there. But they also have this company that they haul manure from the lagoons in tanks, and they're still in, I think, construction phase. But then they take it to this facility where it's turned into biochar, some of it for fertilizer, some of it is actually then turned into biogas, which then they inject into a pipeline that a local electric co-op plans to buy. But again, you still have methane issues in terms of, in the pipelines. It's probably the best thing that I have seen in terms of getting the lagoons, at least the worst of it, out of there. I've actually been to the prototype of the facility before and actually smelled what had gone through the process, and it didn't smell like anything. But so that may help the quality of life, but it doesn't address the humanitarian issues. It doesn't address the natural gas issues and the methane leakage. It possibly might get rid of the smell.
Got it. Thank you. Well, then I think that's a great segue to talk a little bit about challenges. So I think people might be wondering, well, okay, if there's a problem and there might be solutions, or maybe the solutions aren't that clear yet, but maybe we should be working more on how can we come up with our solutions. The question is often, well, what are elected officials and policymakers doing? And why haven't they taken more steps to, for instance, reduce water contamination, methane pollution, other ripple effects? Georgina?
Yeah, the short answer is the farm lobby, and the incredible political and economic power that it has, and its allies in Congress. It's important to remember that when CAFOs first started becoming a thing in the late 70s, early 80s, the bedrock environmental laws that were on the books at that point, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, they didn't even conceive of a CAFO. So there's nothing in those laws that really address CAFOs. The Clean Water Act does, kind of nominally and kind of, in a sort of porous way, I would argue. But since then, there have been attempts to get agricultural facilities to report at the facility level. As Phil and I have written about, there have been regulatory attempts to measure ammonia and hydrogen sulfide under the Clean Air Act. There have been a lot of attempts to get this very unregulated industry better regulated. And all of those attempts have basically failed. In fact, appropriations legislation passed every year for the past, I think, 20 years has specifically said that the agriculture industry does not have to report its methane emissions. So there's been this longstanding agricultural exceptionalism that has been kind of maintained by this very strong lobby with a lot of power, both symbolically and actually. If you look at the polluting industries, greenhouse gas emitting industries by sector, the one that has increased its emissions the most since 1990 has been agriculture. And that's mostly because of methane and mostly because of nitrous oxide. And that's mostly because of CAFOs. But there's been a total hands-off policy from a regulatory standpoint because it's just been almost impossible to touch the industry because there's just a lot of power there and they're very, very good at wielding it.
Phil, did you want to add a little bit? I mean, obviously you were looking at this, some of these very issues in your series with Georgina.
Yeah, so I started out by saying, how all industries have to report their emissions at the facility level, except for agriculture. And Georgina talks about that exceptionalism. Unfortunately, the pendulum's swinging in the opposite direction now, where now no industry going forward will have to report its emissions at the facility level under rollbacks under the current administration. That said, there are environmental organizations that are looking to fill that hole. One group whose data we looked at in our reporting, a group called Climate Trace, that is mapping methane emissions from CAFOs from all sectors of the economy, and not just in the US, but globally. And so there are efforts to try to fill that hole, but it'd be much better if it was regulated here in the US and elsewhere.
Got it. Lisa?
Yeah, to Georgina's point about, the capture of by the farm lobby, I mean, elected officials, not just in the federal level, but at the state level, receive enormous campaign contributions from Smithfield Foods, PAC, or Prestige Farms PAC, or the Farm Bureau, and the lobbyists are at the legislature every day. There's no way that an environmental group can possibly out lobby the ag industry. I think the other thing to think about is that, at least in North Carolina, these industries, and I'm thinking more of hogs, they have completely monopolized the local economy. So it makes it very difficult for local officials to buck the trend, because the counties have built their entire economic fortunes such that they are. A lot of these counties are still very poor around the hog industry. It reminds me of, in some ways, the auto industry, when there were cities that, everybody worked for the plant, but then when those closed, it was, just bleak. So, you won't find too many people at the local level, and I would extend that to even local newspapers, who will buck the hog industry because of the economic. They're basically taking these counties hostage.
Anika Jane, what are you seeing in Iowa?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting here in Iowa because there are some pretty simple steps that could be taken by state agencies, the state DNR, to give a better grasp on water pollution from manure from CAFOs, or to just give us a better sense of to keep track better. And yet, year after year, the Clean Water Act for Iowa is proposed and fails to pass in the House legislature. And I mean, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, the consolidation of this industry means that these are not small family farms. These are powerful national, multinational entities, and they wield a lot of sway with even, local governments, financially, politically. Yeah, it's as Lisa said, these communities are somewhat held hostage, um, even while they're being held hostage by these bigger players.
Well, thank you for this fascinating discussion, an important one too, and thanks to all of you for watching today and supporting our journalism at Inside Climate News.